Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Sarath, for nice introduction, even though it will be flattering. Yeah. And again, I would like to thank Advocata for giving me the opportunity to make this presentation. And I have already learned a lot from very rich presentations yesterday. Now, I would like to begin with some opening remarks about how this session and my presentation fit within the overall focus of the conference. The President, in his presentation, emphatically mentioned that there is no way out for Sri Lanka other than going to sign an agreement with the IMF. And he indirectly said that we would not have faced this calamity if we went to IMF 2 years ago. Then we had a very interesting presentation by Dr. Virathai Shantiprabhu. He told us the very interesting and insightful story about Thailand. Now, he emphasized the role of IMF in the structural adjustment program after the 1997-98 crisis. It was a huge IMF program with 17.2 billion US dollars. But he clearly highlighted that even though IMF program helped banking restructuring and stabilizing the country, there was a very significant domestic component in the reform process. Say they reformed their foreign direct investment regime, and then they rewrote law to give independence to the central bank and brought new ministers, people from the business community to run the country. There were a lot of changes which are beyond the IMF program. The point he made was that IMF program helped, but there was a strong local component. That's a big lesson for us. Then, after the IMF program, Thai economy recovered very rapidly. In my own work, I have done an analysis about the way the sources of Thai economy's recovery. Between 1999 and 2005, out of total growth increment, 75% came from tradable sectors. The reform helped shifting the incentive structure from non-tradable, the construction and other things, toward the tradable sector. And export sector played a very important role in the recovery process. And after that reform, Thailand has never gone to the IMF. And that is also the Asian story. Out of the 5 crisis-affected countries in East Asia, none of the countries have gone to the IMF after 1998, during that 3-decade period. Again, if you look at South Asia, India had a massive reform in 1991, but India has not gone to the IMF after that. Then again, tiny economy, Bangladesh, over the last 3 decades, Bangladesh has not gone to the IMF, right? They have even helped us to face the crisis recently. Then the real issue is why Sri Lanka has been a repetitive IMF client. We have gone to IMF 16 times, now we are getting ready to sign the 17th agreement. In other words, actually, when you look at financial history in the world, even though we are located in Asia, we are an African country. All the repetitive boroughs in the world are in Africa. Angola has gone 20 times, right? Then Zambia is again going to go there for the 13th time. Then, even though geographically we are located in Asia, partly we are an African country. Now, why is it? We need to look at a little bit history. Now, the problem in Sri Lankan policy debate is that we are a forgetful nation. We do not try to learn lessons from history, right? Let me say a few things in order to set the stage for my presentation. Now, when we gained independence from the British in 1941, actually we inherited not only an export-dependent economy, but also welfare-oriented economy. People forget about it, right? During the 3 decades leading to independence, our semi-independent government introduced a lot of welfare system. We already had a free education system, free health care, food rationing, free distribution of rice, free of charge. Everything was there in the package. It was a dynamic export-oriented economy with a strong welfare component. But during that period, we had thriving export industries. In 1950, but the time when we attained independence, around that time, Sri Lanka was awash with foreign exchange. Our first Prime Minister, Ms. D.S. Senanayake, didn't even want to spend time by talking to the IMF team. When they were here, he said, I have a lot of other important things, but we are not a bigger nation. We don't need World Bank support, right? That was the situation. Then what happened? We inherited welfare-oriented economy with a thriving export industries. Then, unfortunately, the fortune of the colonial export industries started diminishing because of various reasons. But the policy emphasis was more on that welfare component, right? Because policymakers were already thinking about the next election. One prime minister even promised to bring and distribute rice from the moon, you remember. Say, the welfare orientation increased with a huge budget burden on the budget, but we failed to restructure the economy. During the period from 1950 until late 1970s, in response to challenges, we implemented what I call like austerity policies. We turned inward instead of becoming more export-oriented. We don't need another example from East Asia. Look at Mauritius. Mauritius was the prison for Sri Lanka. Our last prime minister was sent there as a prisoner, right? It was a useless, hopeless country. But Mauritius started opening the economy from early 70s, right? Now, Mauritius per capita income now is 11,000. They never had to go to the IMF, right? But we first turned our policy direction in the entirely wrong way. And then there was a bold attempt in 1977 to reverse the development pattern, to make the country more outward-oriented. Unfortunately, the reforms were half-hearted. Actually, the reformers did not listen to World Bank or IMF to their advice in a way when they prepared the reform program. It was a bold attempt, though. At the same time, civil law prevented us from benefiting from these reforms. And then reforms were broadened in the early 90s, and there were significant gains, even though we could not become another East Asian country. Remember, 1994 election, actually the alternative party, the so-called left-wing party came into power by promising to continue with liberalization reforms, simply because the gains were visible at that time. Professor Mick Moore, who talked to us yesterday, has written a beautiful article about it, why the 77 reform eventually became bipartisan policy. And yesterday, I think his name, Mr. Ajit Gunawardena, made the point that one of the most important reforms over the last 44 decades was done by left-wing government, privatizing the plantation sector. Again, the telecom reform, all these things continue during that period. But unfortunately, after ending of the civil war, there has been a massive backtracking from these reforms. When peace came to the country, there was opportunity for us to continue with the reforms in a better way, with further reforms, in order to redress that massive imbalance in the economy, huge welfare orientation, but lack of dynamic tradable sector. We had that opportunity, but we missed it. Now, my presentation begins with that point, right? To summarize what I mentioned, we inherited welfare economy, and then emphasis of the policy regime for 3 decades was to increase the welfare network, but without thinking about providing the groundwork to continue with these policies. We became inward-oriented. Then we attempted to become outward-oriented, and the reforms did not work well. Still, there were significant gains which were instrumental in making the reform bipartisan. But during the post-Civil War era, there have been significant backtracking. And let me start my presentation from there. I'm going to focus on 2 issues. The first issue is how anti-tradable bias in the incentive structure made the Sri Lankan economy vulnerable to the present crisis, right? Here, I think you are familiar with the term tradables. I have defined them in the second slide. You can have a look at them later. Tradables are basically actual exports as well as products which are close substitute for exports, tradables. Then we have importable. Imports and goods produced domestically that are close substitutes for imports. Taken together, we call them tradables. Now, our incentive structure throughout the post-independence period has favored non-tradable. Non-tradable mean construction, utilities, and all the other services, right? And then that anti-tradable bias or pro-non-tradable bias intensified during the last 3 decades. That's the point I want to highlight. Secondly, how to redress anti-tradable bias as part of the stabilization and structural adjustment reform. Again, Thai story, stabilization itself is not enough. We need to restructure the economy to redress the non-tradable bias. That's how Thailand did not, made the economy resilient to further crisis. That is the East Asian story as well. Now, this is the way I'm going to structure the rest of the presentation. Little bit theory in 3 paragraphs, debt crisis, premier. Then I'm going to discuss about anti-tradable bias and how it made the country vulnerable to the crisis. Then thirdly, I'm going to focus on policies for redressing the anti-tradable bias as part of the IMF package. Now, very briefly, debt crisis, debt or any financial crisis is basically can be defined as loss of confidence in a country's ability to manage debt or balance of payment position. Debt distress situation causing a severe disruption in the functioning of the economy. That's what has happened in Sri Lanka. There's a huge literature about why countries succumb to crisis. There are 2 different theories. Firstly, self-fulfilling panic theory. Now, the second one, vulnerability theory. Now, what the self-fulfilling panic theory says, actually there's a huge theoretical literature explaining the possibility of a crisis even when a country is running fine. Everything looks fine, suddenly the country succumbs to a crisis. A crisis is prompted by a sporadic event. I will call it a trigger, striking both guilty and innocent countries alike. That was the mentality prevailed in Sri Lanka immediately after the pandemic, right? Politicians say that we were fine, everything was going well, but the pandemic created this problem. Now, this idea has lost credibility actually in the financial crisis literature. Trigger itself is not going to create a crisis. Think about the pandemic. Virus come, not everybody succumb to the virus. Some people remain agile. Some people became sick with the virus, right? In East Asia, every country was affected by the virus, but only Sri Lanka became a problem country, right? Therefore, virus itself has not been a problem. Then the more relevant theory is here, vulnerability theory. A debt crisis is caused by a combination of 2 things. Firstly, vulnerability. Secondly, trigger. Without a trigger, crisis might not happen at a given time, but it will happen someday, right? If you are vulnerable. Vulnerability is an unstable macroeconomic condition. One of the great economists in this area, he has nicely defined it. Vulnerability means that if something goes wrong, then suddenly a lot goes wrong. Think about Sri Lanka. We were vulnerable with a huge debt overhang and debt repayment obligations and so on, right? That was the vulnerable situation. Then when the trigger hit and the crisis happened, lot went wrong. Even political instability, aragale and everything, right? Therefore, it is a combination of vulnerability and the trigger. Therefore, we need to focus on the sources of vulnerability. Now, my focus is on how non-tradable bias in the economy, which intensified during the last 2 decades, contributed to this crisis. Now, the whole story is summarized in this slide, but I am going to show some pictures to deepen the understanding related to this point. Firstly, what we had from about 2005, I will call it a debt-driven spurt in the economy, right? And then particularly after the civil law, the country started building infrastructure in a massive way by borrowing initially from China and secondly from more expensive sovereign debt issues and so on. Then the growth spurt was underpinned by a massive non-tradable bias. There was a non-tradable bias in the economy, but it intensified during that period. Then what was the outcome? It was the vulnerability to COVID-19 shock. Firstly, we had a massive debt overhang by 2019, over $50 million mostly dollar-denominated debt, right? Then by 2020, according to available estimate, our debt obligations for the coming 2 years was about $5 billion. Every year we had to use foreign exchange reserves equivalent to about $5 billion for amortization of debt as well as interest payment. Then the debt service burden as the percentage of export as well as tradable production had increased massively. Then the reserves declined dramatically during that period. Therefore, the underlying source of the vulnerability, the outcome here was basically the debt-driven growth during that period. Now let us turn to some of the slides. This is Sri Lankan GDP growth rate per capita, growth rate adjusted for population growth. You can see that during the period here, I don't have a pointer here, I don't know how to. You can see that during the period from about 2004-5, we had the most rapidly growing period of the Sri Lankan economy. In 1 year, the growth rate reached beyond 9%. And during that period, people were very happy without understanding the source of growth during that period, right? It is just like the difference between a strong, normal wrestler and a sumo wrestler, right? A sumo wrestler is big, right? By feeding a lot of non-nutritious food, fattening thing, right? But the sumo wrestler does not live long. Average life expectancy is about 30 years or 40, right? Real wrestler is very strong, but he looks relatively skinny compared to a sumo wrestler. In other words, our growth during that period was similar to a sumo wrestler, basically. Now, look at the data. Now, here, total tradable production, basically used in national accounts, I separated tradable production, exports and exportables, and import competing goods. And I don't have time to explain how it is done. Then I have again, total tradable production, which is the red line. The black line is export, which is a more direct measure of tradability. Now you can see non-tradable production share, in fact, has been declining. Actually, it's a, in a way, natural process. When an economy grows, services share increase to a certain extent. But there was a dramatic turnaround from about mid-2010s, right? There had been a decline, but the decline expedited during that period. Showing the production structure shifting to non-tradable activities. The export story is even more telling. You can see from about late 70s, because of the market-oriented reforms which gained impetus from the further reforms in early 90s, export to GDP ratio increased, right? I think in your writing you had highlighted this point. Yeah. Now look at what happened to that ratio. It has plummeted during this period. It declined from 20% to about 10% during that period. Therefore, the non-tradable bias in the economy during that period is very clear. Now, central bank report and many people who talk in the parliament show this picture or tell something similar. If you express total debt in the country as a percentage of GDP, actually we did not have a big problem in recent years. I remember when I gave a lecture at the planning ministry, the director who later became he made the point that the debt burden in Sri Lanka was much higher in the early 90s compared to recent years. But this figure, to me, is a bogus figure, simply because the denominator, GDP, had been weighted by non-tradable goods. Non-tradable goods do not help you to repay your debt, right? Therefore, to get a meaningful picture, you have to go beyond the data and do better calculations. This is my better calculations. External debt relative to tradable GDP. Ignore non-tradable sector, express debt as a percentage of total tradable GDP. And then even better indicator is total debt as a percentage of export earnings. Here export earnings is both merchandise export as well as services export. Now, both indicators clearly indicate the problem. I mean, the debt dependence in the country has been historically high during this period, simply because the policy regime shifted from traded orientation to non-traded sector. Our debt burden relating to our ability to repay worsened during that period. Therefore, the story is complete here, right? And then debt service ratio accordingly had reached historical height. Then that is my part of my presentation, how the country became vulnerable to the crisis. Then the important lesson summarized here is be careful in comparing growth rates. Look at the sectoral composition of underlying growth. Think about the difference between a sumo wrestler and a real wrestler. Then I come to sources of anti-tradable bias during that period. This is going to be the focus of our discussion, but this is the key point. Excess focus on non-tradable sectors during that period naturally tilted the incentive structure against tradable production. It happened in any country. It has a popular term called Dutch disease, because the term was coined by the Economist magazine about what happened in Netherlands after the discovery of North Sea oil, right? The huge amount of resources came to non-tradable sector, tradable sector shrank, right? Now, that non-tradable bias built into the system was exaggerated or compounded by three other factors during that period. Firstly, exchange rate policy. Now, we have been making this mistake all the time. Say, we focus mostly on inflation and use the exchange rate to tame inflation, right? It's called, you use exchange rate, nominal exchange rate, as an inflation anchor, ignoring the fact that what is needed for avoiding anti-tradable biases, preventing appreciation of the real exchange rate, nominal exchange rate adjusted for relative prices. Look at this figure. The real exchange rate here is the black line. After the 77 reform, actually the numerical magnitude increased. That means real exchange rate appreciated, improved competitiveness of the economy. That competitiveness was not maintained during the ensuing period, simply because we intervene in the foreign exchange market to tame inflation, ignoring the importance of real exchange rate in resource allocation. That pattern intensified during the last 2 decades, right? The pump in money into non-tradable sectors, at the same time trying to keep the nominal exchange rate virtually constant in order to tame inflation. And you can see what happened here. Now, then the second point, the tariffs regime became more and more distorted. Do you know, by 2000, many people expected that we are moving towards a more uniform tariff structure. There has been significant tariff cuts, but these patterns were reversed by introducing a lot of tariffs and other quantitative restrictions. And therefore, when the trade regime become more and more protectionist, it become anti-exports virtually. It is the famous Lerner symmetry theorem. When you protect industries, and we have done it in a big way in recent years, then importers will make abnormal profit, but export or tradable sectors suffer, right? That's the second. Thirdly, policy backsliding relating to foreign direct investment. This is a very important point. I did a study for the World Bank by digging into investment records and BOI. During 2005 and 2013, about 200 or more export-oriented firms closed down business in this country. And at that time, people were talking about a second BOI in the other tower. When investors come, they have to go to another BOI to get approval. The approval process got distorted, 10% commission, all these things killed the foreign direct investment regime. Actually, I have talked to some Korean exporters, firms in Seoul. They say that we will have second thought about coming to Sri Lanka at that time, right? All the Korean investors left the country, not a single one, right? Then natural non-tradable bias was intensified by policy errors during that period. Now, I think I can stop here. Then the basic, can I take 2 minutes? Yeah. Reform for redressing anti-export bias. Again, Thai story. IMF is very useful in the stabilization package, right? But naturally, their mission is to achieve balance of payment stability virtually. Now in Sri Lankan case, balance of payment deficit had closely followed the budget deficit. Therefore, that's the case in many developing countries. Therefore, IMF is going to focus mostly on fiscal consolidation. Nothing is wrong with it. Actually, that's a saying that IMF means it is mostly fiscal. IMF, right? Then why? It is natural. Sri Lanka is a twin deficit country. Our trade deficit has been mirrored in budget deficit. Therefore, we are not going to blame the IMF, right? The current account deficit is approximately identical to government budget deficit. Remember, identity does not mean causation. That's simple arithmetic, right? After the event, when you balance national accounts, budget deficit is closely related to external deficit, current account deficit. It does not necessarily imply that budget deficit caused the current account deficit. It is simply an identity, right? This is, I have explained in a slide. You can go through it later. Now, this is the story. You have current account deficit, which is the black line. The blue line is the budget deficit, right? They have gone together. Budget deficit has closely followed the current account deficit and the vice versa, the identity. But remember, in addition to that, there's a private sector deficit, which is the red line. The private sector expenditure and private sector income difference between the two. Now, private sector has managed to live above the water, naturally. I mean, there was only one or two deficit. Therefore, private sector we can't blame. It is basically the public sector. But when you compare this with Thailand or other East Asian countries, the story is very different. In these countries, saving rate has been very high. Say Thai saving rate is closer to 40% compared to our about 20 around. Therefore, even when the country is running a budget deficit, private sector has compensated for that. In all the Asian countries, that's the story. I have written a different paper on this issue. Government deficit can be tolerated if the private sector generates more saving. It has not happened in Sri Lanka. Partly non-tradable bias can be there. That's a big research issue we have to think about, right? And then IMF approach to reform, therefore, assume a tight link between the budget deficit and the balance of payment deficit. That is their mission. We can't blame them, right? But the national account identity that link budget deficit to current account deficit does not necessarily imply causation running from one to another. We have to keep that in mind. Taming inflation, of course, through budget, fiscal operation can help improving the real exchange rate. That's a fact, right? But anti-tradable bias depend on many other factors. Again, the Thai story, you rely on IMF to stabilize the economy, but take additional policy measures as the reform package to redress the anti-export bias. Therefore, in an economy where anti-export bias has underpinned vulnerability to the crisis by building up a massive debt overhang, like Sri Lanka, it is necessary to combine expenditure reduction policy, that is the IMF package, high interest rate, and taxation and other things. You need to combine them with expenditure switching policies, changing the incentive structure towards tradable sector. Again, one should not make the mistake that we should talk only about exports. Import competing industries are equally important, but you have to promote them, unlike Sri Lankan situation now, imports in quotas and other things in a competitive market context. I am talking about tradables here. Then just go back to that slide 15. We need to reverse all these three areas. Never use exchange rate, nominal exchange rate, only to tame inflation, but focus more on real exchange rate, because real exchange rate is the key determinant of tradable production in an economy. Therefore, some people like Rudiger Dornbusch, he argued that we should learn to live with at least some inflation, but focus more on avoiding real exchange rate appreciation. This is a very important point for Sri Lanka. Then if I had time, I compared Sri Lanka's own experience under IMF program with that of other countries. We went to IMF 16 times. Out of them, 12 times we went there because of balance of payment problem. Then central bank knew how to tweak data, right? Then you can postpone investment projects or introduce temporary tariff increases and satisfy IMF, right? Then if you achieve that target, then you get money. Then when you study this 16 program, what we see is that we completed about 7 of them, and tweaking had played a very big role, right? You postpone investment at the expenses of long-term growth and various things, and satisfy the IMF. But this time, it has to be different. We need to combine stabilization with the reform I discussed. Let us hope this trip to Washington, D.C. is going to be the 17th and the last trip. And no more IMF visits, just like Thailand. But to achieve that objective, we need to redress anti-export bias, which had been the culprit throughout in our problem. I'll stop at that.